Welcome to our webinar today on execution, how leaders go about getting things done. We think this really begins by bringing together three very important elements. The first being having a clear vision and overall strategy for where you're going. That secondly is combined with the efficient action that comes from the culture and the organizational structure that supports execution. And the third big clump of activities have to do with people's individual behavior. So execution obviously depends upon individuals, and we think that how they act, their ability to set stretch goals, their ability to move more rapidly, these are what come together to form an overall picture of execution. Execution has some objectives. I mean, it's trying to move from things that are in the idea stage or that they're a good theory to having them be actually implemented. It's moving from discussions about, well, why should we do something? What's this all about? To how do we do it? How are we going to make this happen? And finally, it kind of moves from what needs to be done to really when shall it be done? What are the specific timetables and milestones that we're going to work to? It reminds me a little bit of the old Ross Perot comment about if you see a snake, just kill it. Don't appoint a committee. Don't call a consultant or hire. Just if you see a snake, kill it.
I think you ought to call a consultant. Okay. Well, thanks, Jack. And again, what we wanted to do was show you some data around execution. We were doing some research where we looked at people who were rated as having high performance, and they did well on behaviors. So it was a combination of both. We compared these to the other raters or the other people rated in the organization. It's a fairly large study. And then we looked at the top 10 items showing the largest significant difference between, again, the top-rated managers and the others. And what we found in there were, and you can see in the yellow there, many of the items in those top 10 dealt with this whole issue of execution, about achieving goals and striving for excellence and going above and beyond and does everything possible to achieve goals. Now, as we thought about execution, we thought it'd be interesting to show you some data. And we looked at the difference between males and females. So Jack, what are typically females tend to be thought of as being better at kind of that nurturing competency, that kinds of thing?
The soft, warm, fuzzy stuff.
Yeah. Gosh, when we looked at the data, turns out they're a lot better at execution. That's statistically significant at the 0.000 level, 000 level. That's a huge difference between males and females. And so when we look at our overall data, and this is a large data set with 47,000 data points in a global database there, that's pretty convincing. When we look at that data over age, what we see is this male distribution. And what's interesting is from 25 or from below 25 to 30, it goes up. Ability to execute goes up. But after that, it just declines. It is a downhill slope. But when we look at the data for women, it goes down a bit, but it levels off above average, I might say, and it stays there throughout their career. So we're finding, and we have compelling evidence to show that women tend to be better at execution than men. The next thing I looked at was this levels in the organization, where we have top management, senior management, middle management, supervisors. And I thought, well, who is going to be the best at execution? Who talks about it the most? Who yaks about it every day? It's the CEO, right, Jack?
Right, right.
Jack doesn't do that. But what's interesting, when we measured people on execution, we found that the supervisors were rated more positively than the top management. And when I looked at this data, Jack, what I thought is it's the size of the object that's the difficulty here. Supervisors have a very focused thing that they're moving. They have goals that they can get their hands around. CEOs have that's a big rock to move. And I think that's the difference there. Do you see something else?
Well,
there?
I think the senior leaders are being held to a higher standard, I think, as you would expect.
Oh, that's true.
And so I think that the combination of a more specific, focused target and the people holding the more senior people to a higher standard may account for some of those differences.
Yeah. We then looked at functional areas and who is the top in execution. Well, of course, it's sales. They really get execution. Customer service, general management, legal, finance, and accounting. They're all above average. You can look at that list. Safety's last, followed very closely by HR and training. Well, the next thing we looked at was differences by geography. And as you see here, the U.S. is above average, 56th percentile. Other areas tend to be lower in general. But then when we looked at specific countries, guess who comes out on top? China. Now, that shouldn't be a surprise to us, should it? China is very aggressive, followed by South Korea, and then the United States, then Spain, Pakistan, Mexico, Hong Kong. You can see the ratings there by country. And that's an interesting dynamic, and we've sort of seen that from different countries, the higher ratings there. When we looked at execution, and we looked at that compared to 15 other competencies, what we found was the skill level, and this is a study of 76,000 leaders, global study, it was rated as number 4 from the top. It was a skill that is very good. It had a high level of competence. Not the top, but it was number 4. And then we asked people which of the competencies and capabilities was most important. And it was interesting that for your primary manager and your secondary manager, execution was the number 1 most important thing. Does it surprise you that your boss thinks that getting things done is the most important thing for you to focus? It shouldn't, and so I guess we're making the point here that this is a very critical competency and one you ought to pay attention to.
Okay, so now we move on to what is the driving force for overall task accomplishment. So our research then turned to looking at what are the elements that come together, and we looked at this skill of execution and its relationship to having a really clear strategy. And so we began by looking at those individuals who scored highly on the topic of having a clear strategy, but they did not score as well. They weren't in the top quartile when it came to execution. The probability of them being an extraordinary leader was roughly 8%. This is the group that would be kind of typified, I guess, by ready, aim, and clear strategy, very little execution.
Lots of aiming there.
Lots of aiming. If you flip that in the opposite direction and say, what about those people who really were good at execution but didn't have a very well-defined strategy? The chances of that person being being an extraordinary leader was 3%. So this is the group that you could describe as ready, fire, aim, aim.
Oops.
Oops. But when you combine those two together, the power of A and B coming together when a person is in the top quartile on both of those, what you see is that the probability of that person being an extraordinary leader is obviously not 11%, but actually is 89%. This combination of ready, aim, fire really produces excellent results.
Jack, I love that. And what we're doing is we're tipping our hat here around this whole issue of execution. If you think about, let's say you want to improve your execution and you're not doing very well at it. It's a weakness. Your boss is telling you need to do better. Well, what they might do is they might write down their goals, make goals a priority, and they might not get distracted, and they stay focused on the goals that they have. So they're really paying a lot of attention, and they're working hard, right? But then and we know that, again, there are some people when they come to work, we need to kind of teach them the basics of execution. And that gets you from bad to good. But the question we always ask is, how do you go from good to great? And so let's say that execution is a strength, and use that same kind of logic. Well, okay, so here's how to get better. And, the ideas usually come out, well, just work harder or work faster. Maybe you could sleep at the office. Well, that might work a little bit, but you're going to get burned out, or all your people are going to quit. It doesn't have a long-term effect. And so we ask the question, what do people that are great at execution do to be great? And we looked at thousands of leaders, and we tried to analyze those that were great at execution and what behaviors they engaged in. These behaviors tended to enable execution. They tended to leverage the execution. And it's like the powerful combination slides that Jack showed you. It was the combination of hard work and execution and strategy that really created this powerful combination. In fact, that's one of the elements. So what we found in that research were 14 elements or behaviors that were connected to execution. And we're not going to talk about every one, but we're going to illustrate a bunch of those. Jack, as you look at all those behaviors, you sort of were able to cluster those. How did you do that?
Yes, and so what we see here is that these are arranged starting up at that 12 o'clock on the dial in descending order from a statistical point of view. But from a conceptual point of view, it seemed like if you could cluster them into three buckets, they would make a little more sense. So the first bucket was having a clear vision and strategy, and here we have the items about being, having a good plan and being well organized, and secondly, being able to anticipate the problems that might arise. Then the second cluster, creating an execution environment, which involves having this culture of accountability where people really hold each other accountable for what they committed that they would do, and then being sure that you've got the right kind of resources available. And then the third item there, creating high-performance teams. And then finally, the third bucket had to do with the individual behavior, the leader's behavior of setting stretch goals, and you can read the rest of them there, moving with speed and so forth. So we luckily, this very much reinforced our earlier kind of description of what is execution broadly, and we see that it gets fleshed out by these companion behaviors that define execution more specifically. So just taking the first one, planning and organization. I mentioned earlier this wonderful combination of when you have a plan, that then you're able to kind of execute according to a good process and find ways to thereby create much higher levels of commitment from the people who must execute the plan. Without a clear strategy, execution gets very meandering and very disjointed. And you see this executive kind of looking at this chart. That's what happens when there is no clear strategy. Long ago, Confucius, this wise kind of philosopher, made the observation that the man who chases two rabbits catches neither. And here again, the lack of a plan leads people to not being efficient at execution. Happens that I live not too far away from several dairy farms. I'm always amused as I drive by them to see the cows that are spending most of their time, it seems like, on the fence, always sticking their head through the fence, trying to get that grass that's on the other side. There's a lot of grass back in the pasture often, but they just seem like they really enjoy kind of getting that grass that's on the other side. So again, there is this enticement to kind of go off and look for what's not in your field, and that's what happens when there's not a clear plan.
It is amazing in organizations how people are always sort of saying, we ought to do this, or we ought to do that. They're always looking outside the strategy, and that's that same behavior as cows. Another characteristic of leaders who were very effective at execution was their ability to anticipate problems. Now, to test this, we looked at the ability to anticipate problems, and we looked at people at the bottom 10 and top 10 and the middle areas there. And then we looked at execution ability. And, Jack, that is about as linear as anything I've ever seen. I mean, this ability to execute and if you say, what's the problem here? People jump into a project, and what do they assume? It's just going to go like they plan. They take time to plan, but they don't take the time to think about what could go wrong. And again, research is quite good on the fact that if people will just sit down and ask themselves that question, what could go wrong? What could get in the way of this brilliant plan that we've constructed? They actually can anticipate some things, and their ability to anticipate things is fairly good. And by anticipating them, they A, see them coming sooner, and B, they start to think about, well, what are we going to do if that happens? Another thing that really gets in the way of execution is integrity and trust. There's a lovely quote by Edward Marshall: "Speed happens when people truly trust each other." So what happens on a project when you question a person's integrity and there's a lack of trust? When your boss says, I need you to give extra effort, and I think people start asking, what are they trying to do? And are they going to take advantage of me? And what's going on here? And all these issues of trust come up, and when that does, people slow down. They start to question things.
Well, and certainly if you don't trust people, you tend to do a lot more checking and a lot more kind of agonizing over every little decision, because you are suspicious of their motive and you're suspicious of, why are we doing this? So
people are afraid to move fast or move quickly because they think, oh, they're going to get me. We, in our research, found there's 3 pillars associated with trust. So the question here is, how could I build trust? The first pillar is positive relationships. We trust people we like. We distrust people we don't like. That's pretty simple. So if you'd like people to trust you more, then try to work on the relationship. All right? The second pillar of trust is knowledge and expertise. We trust people that have insight and knowledge and experience. When we're really Jack and I were trying to figure something out the other day, and he said, I know this guy in Salt Lake that's blah, blah, blah. And I'm like, let's get him here. We don't know this guy from Adam, except he's got a great reputation. And we thought, well, that'd be really helpful to have that. And so, we're willing to kind of pay for this guy to come down because we thought he had insight and knowledge. The third pillar of trust is consistency. If I tell you I'm going to be there at 8 in the morning, I'm there at 8 in the morning. And the inconsistency causes people to lack trust. The consistency builds trust. So those are the three pillars. The next thing we looked at was the speed at which we act. We did an analysis where we were, again, looking at these top performers versus others. We found a huge difference. And then when we looked at the top 20 items and factor analyzed them, we found a factor that really encapsulated what the difference was between the best leaders and the others. And it's these three items, and they all dealt with speed, right? So spots problems early, has the ability to anticipate, respond quickly to problems, quickly recognizes situations where change is needed. Now, one of the things that people who execute do well is they move quickly. And we found that speed is very, very important. And leaders that move faster and have a faster pace are able to be more effective. On our Harvard blog, we even have a little self-assessment called the PACE survey where you can measure your pace. What we did is a study where we looked at a person's ability to execute and their rating on this speed factor. What we found is if you were below the 50th percentile, your execution percentile was the 32nd. But if you went up to the 51st to the 75th, it went up to the 58th percentile. And then the 72nd, 82nd, if you were between the 86th and the 95th. The 96th percentile, if your speed is at the 96th percentile, your execution's at the 90th. Now, what we became interested in here is if there was any downside to speed. Would people moving too quickly drive execution down? But what we found is the stronger the speed, the higher the execution. That continued to go up, and there's no downside to speed whatsoever.
The next thing we looked at was this whole notion of how you accomplish things often depends upon the ability to marshal the energies and enthusiasm of other people. Leadership, by definition, means you're not doing something alone, but you're doing it with the help of others. Unfortunately, there prevails in our modern culture right now a message and a belief that only 30% of the people who work in organizations here in the U.S. Are in that boat rowing forward. That if there were 10 people who were supposed to be rowing, only 5 of them would not be rowing at all. They'd just be kind of resting on their oars and kind of looking at the seashore or the side of the river. 2 of the people would be rowing in the opposite direction. They would be kind of rowing against the others. And only 3 would be rowing in the direction that you hoped the boat would be moving in. Now, I don't happen to believe that data. I think that data is absolutely erroneous. I think the better data that's available would say that probably somewhere between 70 to 90% of people in organizations are engaged. But there's no question that creating high-performance teams really depends upon having people in the organization who are willing to row the boat and row together and going in the right direction. Chances are you've all been on a team, whether in school or at work, that's a little bit like this picture that we see here of tipping over and not doing well. And we know how difficult that is, how challenging it is. Our research on high-performing teams, and this was data coming from about nearly 67,000 teams, team leaders do several things really, really well. And what creates these high-performance teams are that the team leaders inspire more than they drive. They are very quick to kind of resolve conflicts between the members of the group. They're adept at setting stretch goals. They're very good at communicating. And they are generally well trusted by the other members of the team.
Well, that makes a huge difference. And boy, if we've been on that team from hell, we sure know it. And we've been on the high-performance team, it makes a big difference. Another characteristic of leaders who had great execution was they gave honest feedback in a helpful way. Again, we looked at the data. Here's the data. You can see it there. Bottom 10%, top 10%, middle percentiles there. And as you look at the ability to give feedback and the ability to execute, a linear, very linear process there. If you're really bad at giving feedback, your execution ability is at the 24th percentile. If you're great at giving feedback, it's at 81st. There's a huge difference there. Now, the only thing is about this that might be confusing to some people is we said the ability to give feedback, but what we measured here was giving honest feedback in a helpful way. Jack, there's lots of people that give feedback.
Not very helpful.
Not very helpful, and people don't think it's honest. So what is interesting about it is that there's a couple of assumptions that people make when they give feedback. First thing they assume, they imagine that they must have to give you feedback because you don't get the problem. You don't understand what's wrong. And when we ask people, when you get feedback, how often do you already know what's wrong before they tell you, and it's about 74%. So if you think people are surprised by your feedback, they're not. You know, 3/4 of the time, they already know what's wrong. You don't need to sort of blast them with it. They already know it. They've discovered it. They're not stupid. So we tend to think, well, they obviously they wouldn't be doing it if they didn't know it. Well, they don't. They know it, but they're not able to change it. The other thing is that there's an assumption, because most people don't like giving feedback. It's a little bit like tearing off that bandage. They want to get it over quickly. So they rip it off. When they sit down with somebody, they just blurt it out, and they say, and it's all, and when you talk about feedback, it's all one way. And what we found is this absolute clear correlation between a leader's ability to listen, take time to really understand, and the perception that it was honest feedback. Jack, you've studied this for a long time. Any other insights on that whole giving feedback and how to do it well?
Well, we certainly know that there's broadly two kinds of feedback. We've referred to them as redirecting feedback and reinforcing feedback. And it's fascinating how over the past few years there's been this increasing amount of attention and recognition that positive feedback, that recognition to people is a way of really helping to improve execution. And this begins with our friend Ken Blanchard, who wrote the book 1 Minute Manager and talks a lot about catching people doing something right. We know that there's been some wonderful research done by a professor at Stanford, Carol Dweck, on the importance of giving recognition and positive reinforcement, and the right kind of positive reinforcement to young children and adults. This whole pattern of just, can you get people to take more time to say thanks, to be appreciative, to recognize people for what they've done. And then that then earns you the right and the privilege to, on appropriate occasions, sit down and make suggestions to people in a redirecting kind of way that would say, there may be a better way to handle this. There may be something else that you could do that you're not doing right now. Or there may be some things that you ought to kind of consider stopping doing. And that's that wonderful combination of the redirecting and reinforcing kind of feedback.
When we studied this, we looked at the ability of a person to recognize and reward others and the execution ability. What we found is that being a little bit better at recognition didn't help.
Didn't change that much.
Did change. until you were at the 65th percentile. So I guess if there's an admonition about this, it is just sort of tweaking it a little bit. You might as well not even try. If you really want to kind of get the leverage of recognition, you've got to be above average in terms of your recognition. And as I talk to groups, oftentimes I'll say, did anybody here know someone who recognizes others too often? They just over-recognize. And I always get a few hands that come up. So there are people that might do that. But for the most part, for most of us, what's the problem? We don't recognize enough. So that, I think, is the situation. Well, as we close this webinar here, there's a couple of insights here that I'd like to share with you. As you think about execution, there's these push factors. There's these dimensions of accountability and stretch goals and quick to act and anticipating problems. And it's true. When people give me a deadline, my behavior changes. Until they do, I'm sort of like, I'm in la-la land. But as soon as I get a deadline, then it's like, whoa, I go to work. So pushing helps with execution. But most people believe that's it. That is execution. And what we've demonstrated or tried to demonstrate here today is there's also these pull behaviors, these behaviors like integrity and trust, like providing honest feedback, like providing rewards and high-performance teams. There's another third dimension, and that's that direction, that organization and the strategy. And as you think about those three factors or elements, usually we're probably focused on a couple of those and we're leaving one of them out. And when you do, your execution's going to be below the level that you'd like. So good luck with your execution. Your boss will be very happy because, as we said before, it's the number one thing you ought to pay attention to. So thanks so much for listening.